introduce our program and our two featured speakers. After presentations, there will be a time for questions, so hold your questions until the end. So we've spent the last year looking at family and local history, learning about quilts and their makers, and thinking about how the materials of our lives can be crafted to create meaning. This online guide is available if you're interested in the other programs that we've had. They're all recorded, and you can also view some of the slides of the quilts in the guide. So this is there. If you want to learn more about what we've done this year, that information is available online. Thanks to a generous gift from the Jan and Brant Hauser family, some of whom are with us today, and support from the Jefferson College Foundation, we were able to purchase databases and books for family research, like Ancestry and Fold3, which is a military database, provide presentations and displays like this one, and create this small exhibition of quilts from Jefferson County quilt owners. We hope to encourage you to explore your own history and create something that tells your stories. We would like to thank the following people for lending us their quilts. Quilts are a very personal item, and it's no small thing to entrust a public space with your beloved quilts. So thank you to the following people: Vivian Aubuchon, Patty Black in North Carolina, Carrie Greer, Barb Flesh, Kim Garcia, Shirley Leonard, Debbie Verstring, Natalie Welch, and Susie Welch. We'd also like to thank the quilters, known and unknown, who created the works that are on display. Did I miss anybody that loaned us a quilt? I would also like to thank Adam McFarland, John Lindhorst, and Joette Klein, who provided some of our other programming for this series. I would like to thank the library staff, of course, and the Jefferson College Marketing and PR Department. This is all the result of a lot of folks coming together to create something bigger than any of us. With me today are two people at the center of our quilt exhibition. Natalie Welch, to my right here, is a fiber artist, a maker, an appreciator of the stories and the people behind the art and craft of sewing. Natalie is the guest curator for this display of quilts, and she will share with you her own journey as a fiber artist and maker, her passion for sustainability, and ways that those new to quilting and sewing can find inspiration and help by incorporating new technologies into old practices. Susie Welch is a maker, a social worker, professor of sociology and social work at Jefferson College, and my friend. She is passionate about how we are all stitched together through our shared material culture. She speaks as an academic and as a creator about the many fabric treasures that we often pass down through families and how they contribute to our sense of history and personal meaning. She situates quilting and sewing within the larger story of women's lives. She is inspired by the work of her daughter Natalie and a new generation of makers who are expanding the craft into new and exciting realms. This exhibition of quilts and the theme for our local history programming is the result of one quilt, the person who rediscovered it, and the power of sharing stories. In the spring of 2022, Susie mentioned to me that her daughter Natalie had bartered with a person in exchange for her sewing work, received an incredible 1880s crazy quilt. She was interested in research that might help them learn more about the quilt. That initial reference interview, as we call it here in Library Land, turned into a collaboration and a way to connect Natalie's quilt with our own local history initiative. You will learn more about this from Natalie in a few minutes. First, I want to tell you about someone else at the heart of our exhibition and programming, Jane Hauser. Jane Hauser, her husband Brant, and their family have a deep connection to Jefferson County and Jefferson College. The Brants were not only patrons of many libraries, including ours, during their lives, but a gift from their family provided the funding and the inspiration for this programming. Jane Hauser was Jefferson College's first returning student. Here she is with Jefferson College's first president, signing up for classes. After taking time out to work and care for her family, Jane wanted to go to school to become a librarian. She even worked here at Jefferson College Library. Though she wasn't able to move to Columbia, Missouri to obtain her master's degree in library science, a requirement at that time, she did go on to get a degree in history, and she found other ways to pursue her love of learning, books, art, and local history. Many of the quilts on display in this exhibition were created by Mrs. Hauser and loaned to us by her daughter, Barb Flesh, and her granddaughter, Carrie Greer, both of whom are with us today. Some of them combine Jane's many interests. You can learn more about their stories and the quilts and their maker as you read about them in the exhibition. By combining the gifts of funds from the Hauser family, Jane Hauser's love of the college, libraries, history, and quilting, the wonderful quilts shared with us by Natalie and Susie Welch, and the many other quilts and their stories here on display, we have created an opportunity for you to learn about Jefferson County history, the very American art and craft of quilting, and a chance to think about how you can research, capture, and preserve your own stories. Now I will turn our presentation over to Natalie Welch, who will talk about the quilt that served as our touch point and other quilt stories.
Hi, I'm Natalie. I'd love to start by telling you all more of the story of how this exhibit began. About a year ago, someone approached me at my table at market, like Lisa said, and wanted to trade with me. She picked out something from my shop in exchange for a crazy quilt that she wanted to pass along to me. We made our exchange, and wow, unfolding that quilt was truly an emotional experience. I was so impressed by the gorgeous handiwork, the sheer amount of hours put into creating it, and the decades it survived through. It's hard to describe, but it had so much love and attention worked into the fabrics that it almost felt alive, or like the artist was in the room with me. I didn't expect it, but I definitely teared up. I sent pictures to my mom, and she was beyond excited to come see it. Of course, we opened it up again in my living room, and we just sat in absolute awe of its beauty and detail, so much so that after she saw it, she organized a meeting to have it evaluated. I love my mom. I don't think I'd have had the nerve on my own to do something like that, but it was one of the coolest experiences I've ever had. So thanks to some ribbons incorporated in the quilt on the left there's a detail, Google, and especially to the Franklin County Historical Society in Kansas, I learned that the Ottawa Intermediate Singing Class ribbon on the left was not from Canada, but from Ottawa, Kansas. The Franklin County Historical Society was kind enough to send a few documents about the assembly to me. And on the right, that's a newsprint from 1886, talking about the assembly where it was most likely worked on. So about the assembly, though it was definitely more spiritually focused than today's festival, I can't help but thinking of the Ottawa Assembly as a sort of turn of the 20th century Coachella. What started in New York as a training program for Sunday school teachers became a 2-week-long camp. They wanted to start a second program further west and ultimately chose Ottawa, Kansas, in large part because of their forest park. Same name, different place. A wooded area near a river. It also featured musical performances, famous speakers from different walks of life, along with full days of classes, one of those classes being intermediate singing. So we know at least that this fiber artist was a bit of a Midwestern songbird who made this quilt around 1886 and most likely worked on it at the Ottawa Assembly during the crazy quilt craze. Like the way folks trace back their family trees, we were able to use research, context clues, and the help of a few historians to find this beautiful quilt's town of origin, approximate year of creation, and even a few details about its creator herself. And a little bit of backstory about crazy quilts. Crazy quilts, like the one on display, have been around since the 1870s or 1880s, and the trend came to a close around 1895, which is really a pretty short time period for something that's made such a big impact. In 1876, at the first World's Fair held in the United States, Philadelphia's Centennial Exposition, American needleworkers were exposed to unique and extraordinary designs from Russia, England, and Japan, and the crazy quilt fad began. More of a work of art than a functional quilt, Many of these crazy quilts weren't even backed like the one we have here. They're gorgeous when fully quilted, but without backing, this piece allows us to see the underside of all the hand stitching. The details on the quilts and the numbers of pieces for each quilt was astounding. As you will see when you look at the quilt, the fabrics were numerous: brocade, silk, velvet, muslin, cotton, linen, rich colors and pieces saved from trips to exotic places, a piece from a cherished dress, lining from a loved one's hat. The intricate piecework made of so many remnants of fabric was nothing short of incredible. Crazy quilters could purchase or trade templates to embroider on the quilts. These pieces were embroidered with dozens of symbols, shapes, and memories. Some common images you might see on these quilts include spiders, butterflies, a crescent moon, pets, a drum, bees, flowers, money, couples dancing, and much more. Scraps of exotic or unique fabric were even sometimes purchased just for making these quilts. The crazy quilt craze of this type ended by about 1895, according to Britannica. However, inspired by this trend, there are still plenty of crazy quilt-themed quilts created with dozens of fabric scraps today. Okay, so here I am with Adam McFarland. We had a meeting with Adam McFarland, the curator of clothing and textiles at the Missouri Historical Society. This was when we had it evaluated. We learned so much about this incredible piece of handmade art. It's from around 1886 and contains somewhere around 1,500 hours of hand embroidery and sewing. So put another way, that is 62 and a half days of hand sewing straight through. Although it was authenticated, it's not in good enough condition to be considered museum quality because the necessary repairs would be too costly. My mom had the idea that we show the quilt to Lisa, so we set an appointment to meet with her, and like an incredible library fairy, she made some real magic happen because here we all are. Lisa has brought our experience and this beautiful piece of handmade art together in the same building as many others. With the number of heirloom quilts in this library, it's amazing to think how many hours of handiwork might be filling the building and how many little stories are here. And so, along with amazing library staff, we went to work creating the exhibit. On the last day, we were able to speak over the phone with Barb Flesch, whose mother, Jane Hauser, created some of the incredible quilts on display here. After having the chance to see and hang up some of her mother's quilts, speaking with Barb about her mother's creations and artistic nature was truly such an honor. It was an emotional conversation. She said that Jane had made over 40 quilts in her lifetime, but that her most ambitious work was the Tree of Life quilt, which is currently located in the History Center. Barb said that Jane worked on it over a period of years and that she would say it had 1,000 pieces. Though Jane was an incredible quilter, she practiced other kinds of art too. She had a spinning wheel and spun wool into yarn. She was also a painter and photographer. She and Bryant moved to Jeffco from St. Louis in 1951, drawn by love of the woods. Jane took photos around Jefferson County and painted scenes of historical sites. Her red work quilt depicts the same and is currently located on the second floor. Barb summarized it best when she said that her mom's whole life was like that, full of art, love, and growth. Next slide, please. That's me. In modern quilting, I've seen several examples of quilts made from secondhand material. In my work, and in the work of quite a few of my peers though, we use discarded quilts themselves as material to sew with. For example, I found this wonderful glorified 9-patch quilt covered in dirt for $3 at a thrift store. The amount of quilts that I and other folks have found at thrift stores and even in the Goodwill bins is overwhelming and disheartening. Textile waste is a massive issue for our environment. Every year, people in the United States throw out more than 34 billion pounds of these textiles. Divided across the population, that's more than 100 pounds of textile waste per person each year. I believe there's a time to be precious about vintage quilts and fabrics, and there's a time to rescue and reuse what otherwise would be thrown in the landfill. So, let's walk through an example of my process. I can show this off. And should we pass it?
Sure, yeah. If you want to give it, I go.
All right, thank you. Okay, so let's walk through an example of my process. This hoop is made with a 40s feed sack quilt that is threadbare and disintegrating. Since this quilt was falling apart and already had a square cut out of it, it was passed down to me for free. Like the person said, please take this away from me. And I felt like it would be all right to continue cutting into it. And now it functions as a hand-embroidered stained glass of sorts, letting the light through what's left of the batting, and in places straight through where fabric only used to be. Yeah, exactly. Hold it up and like let the light fall through it, because like it's just falling to pieces. But the embroidered sewing hand represents the bond between the two of us, the creator of the quilt some 80 years ago, and the gal who also used a needle and thread to reframe it, repair it, and give it another chance at life.
Thanks. You can keep going. Yeah, they can.
Feel free to continue passing that around. Next slide, please. Also, in college, I majored in creative writing and minored in fiber arts. In writing, my focus was in poetry. I still enjoy writing, but to me, sewing secondhand fabrics definitely feels like a kind of poetry in its own right. The quilt that I brought was the final project in my first fibers class. Earlier in that semester, we had each been assigned to make a smaller quilted portrait of ourselves. This is that. We were instructed to take a selfie and edit it on the computer using Photoshop to posterize it into a certain amount of layers. I think I used 5. We had learned how to hand dye a gradient in the fabric. Each piece of fabric was an even amount tinted to the next color. You can see there. And then, we learned how to hand dye a gradient into the fabric, and then we used a light table, a full-scale printout of the selfie, and then fabric and Wonder Under to layer it, built up from darkest to lightest. And it was super cool, but fabric dyeing took both more math and chemicals than I tend to enjoy using. And so the final assignment was to make a certain size quilt. I think it was like at least 4 feet by 4 feet. All with my own hand-dyed fabric in whatever design I chose. And I chose to treat the first assignment as a before and create my final project quilt to represent my new after. So that's also me. It was spring, and in March I had gotten a buzz cut. I donated my hair to raise money through St. Baldrick's, who hosted the event on campus. They raised money for childhood cancer research. It was important for me to do this for a few reasons. We had lost someone close to us at a young age to cancer, and it really affected me as a kid. Some of my best friends had done St. Baldrick's and raised money the year before, and I saw how fulfilling it was to be able to make a change. And finally, on a different personal note, at that time I had also gotten disinterested with having long hair and was coming to terms with other parts of my life. So I loved having a buzz cut, and going for a run and feeling the rain on my scalp was a surreal feeling. I was so happy and nervous to be developing as a person and as an artist, and it was all so new. But growth is beautiful, and I'm so lucky I've had the chance to do that and the chance to share it with you all. It's such a powerful thing to create art depicting your own history. From crazy quilts with reminiscent ribbons, to t-shirt quilts with childhood memories, to a college assignment buzz cut quilt, humanity can't help but share stories, experiences, and connections. The hands that created these quilts won't be around forever, but the art that they've made will last much longer. The creator of the crazy quilt, Jane Hauser, and I have all made something that can be celebrated and passed down as part of our legacies. And now, I'm delighted to turn the presentation over to my mom, Susie Welch, who will talk about the connections between our personal stories, family and community connections, and quilting.
Hi, I'm Susie Welch. I'm Natalie's mom. I'm Lisa's friend. And as Lisa mentioned, I also teach sociology and social work here at the college. Natalie and Lisa both talked about our shared curiosity and interest in learning more about the crazy quilt that found Natalie. Her description of the opening of that quilt, it was truly unbelievable. We both felt like we were in the presence of greatness last summer when we opened it, and we both really love to sew. It's functional, it's artistic, and it's fun. My own mom taught me to sew as a little girl. Like many of you, my sisters, my aunts, and friends have all been part of time spent making. Add to that my dad's love for exploring genealogy and family history, and it's clear why the story of this crazy quilt really pulled me in. Natalie and I have been makers for a long time. When it seemed she was old enough, it was a really special experience teaching Natalie how to sew. Much like my early sewing was with my mom, it was less about what we were making and more about the fact that we were doing it together, creating memories, spending time, and making things. On this slide, you see a couple of images. The first one is sort of a primary attempt at embroidery with a little kit. The second one is a favorite fabric from my childhood. And the last one is sort of a collection of different notions, sewing notions from the 1940s and 50s that belong to family members. These all represent some kind of connection to functionality and creativity of sewing as an art and as a way of connecting, the shared tools we use to create and the pieces that we save and share. In our culture, we have a long history of sewing for celebration, weddings, showers, a quilt, or items for a hope chest, bonnets or quilts for new babies, or another new family member just joining the group. These are common. So is sewing for birthdays, graduations, and other milestones when we might create a gift to celebrate. These quilts give us a backdrop for marking a place and time, a special event. You'll even note dates stitched on some of the pieces in the exhibit, so watch for those when you're going through. On this slide, we have a couple examples of sewing in celebration. On the left side is a t-shirt quilt that I made for Natalie's high school graduation. And on the right, we see a double wedding ring quilt that's part of our exhibit also. And that is also made from some pretty unique fabrics, so be sure to ask or look at that when you are viewing the exhibit. These next quilts show us that we don't sew exclusively in joyful times. We sew in times of sadness also. So here we see an example on the left that's called a coffin quilt. On the right, a common trend of embroidering someone's name and the date of their death, memorialized on a quilt. And I'm sure that each of you have examples also of keepsakes that were made in memory of someone, using favorite buttons or symbols or fabrics, a shirt, something that held meaning to remember your loved one. I look at this art and the relationship to fabric, sewing, and stitches through my own experiences, but I also view it through the lens of a social worker. I've studied interactions and relationships and worked with many families over the years. Families, biological or chosen, mean commitment. I've observed these ties, the biological, the blended, the chosen, through a professional and academic lens, and I've come to some important conclusions. Families are tied together, we should say stitched together, if you will, by shared experiences and commitment. And what we know for certain is that the stitches that tie us together came before us and will be passed on to generations after us. We're tied together in celebration and in times of grief and every emotion in between. There are even times when somebody wishes to cut ties, and even that is part of our experience of family sometimes. The quilts in this exhibit and the story of the crazy quilt that found Natalie are examples of material culture. These are elements of culture consisting of society's material objects, and they represent culture that we can touch or feel, things we can find in an exhibit or a museum. But these material items all represent much more: families, values, beliefs, faith, love, tradition. We can even make a connection between the characteristics of families and those of quilt makers. Both require dreaming, dedicating time, planning, patience, creating, cutting out what doesn't work, repairing, reinforcing, and sometimes starting over if that seems best. After thinking about what the quilts represent and their meanings, we can also consider what the sewers and quilters are gaining in this. For women who were making crazy quilts, and for many of us, the experience has brought much more to the table than merely a finished product for keeping warm. The act of quilting, creating with others, even alone sometimes, brings us a sense of creativity, wonder, imagination, and detail, coupled with the balance and organization that's the very nature of quilts. Whether we're appreciating the beauty in the sequence and order of a traditional quilt or the artistic, feel-good qualities of a crazy quilt, we see the textures, designs, complex and decorative stitches that Natalie mentioned, all manner of fabrics, designs, and ideas. It brings the makers to the intersection of function and art, of balance and creativity. Imagine, in times when women were much less free to speak their minds, these women were in quilting groups and could talk about anything when they gathered together. They could talk about relationships, the ups and downs of married life, conflict, pregnancies, faith. parenting, aging, in-laws, all the ups and downs with other women. A sharing of creativity and a safe place where women could find their anchors. And anchors are another symbol frequently embroidered on crazy quilts. Echoing that idea, this topic of Piece Together and the year-long exhibit has created some unique ties for all of us that were part of it. Again, reinforced by thread and fabric, we've shared in conversations of our quilts and our history among families, biological and chosen, between friends, family members, across generations, throughout a county, even a state, and in discussion of these beautiful quilts, keeping our own family histories in mind as we look ahead. Involvement in this project has been by far my favorite event at Jefferson College. It's been an honor and a privilege to consider the creations of so many people, the time, the thought, the experience that went into their work. This diptych is our last image. This was made by Natalie and gifted to me. The title of this diptych is Life and Death. It's my favorite for many reasons. The theme, the context, time, place during which it was made has meaning to us. I look at the work in these pieces, the hand-dyed fabric, the intricacies of the work, the themes of life and death, and I feel moved by a sense of peace and a deep connectedness. It seems fitting that we would include this piece in our discussion of material culture, and it returns us to the idea of families stitched together in joyful times of celebration and in times of sadness or loss. Lisa and Natalie and I agreed that one of the most important takeaways from this year-long experience is sort of a call to action, to explore your history. Maybe your interest starts with an artifact, learning about or creating something that reflects your story. Perhaps a quilt, but maybe not. You might begin writing your family's stories or shared history, or writing your own story by beginning to create experiences and traditions, spending time with those you call family. Keep those threads intact and make your connections stronger over time, reinforcing them as a seam would be reinforced in a quilt. That concludes our presentation, and we wondered if you have questions for any of us.
Any questions? Okay, all right. Well, we
I have one question.
Oh, please, yes,
I was
Diane.
wondering how much of your work is hand sewn and how much do you rely on machine stitching? Or is it a kind of combination of the two?
It's a combination of the two.
Will you
Mostly-
repeat the question, Natalie, just for the film?
Yeah. The amount of hand sewing versus machine sewing I do. I like to do hand embroidery, and then that also involves some like hand sewing in order to like mount it. But if I can, I will machine sew just because it's like quicker, so I can get my idea finished. But I like hand sewing as well. There's something really peaceful about it, so I don't want to lose that skill either. That's not much of an answer, both.
No, it's
Sorry.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Okay.
Like, what is something that you learned through this whole process of researching and helping with the exhibition, researching the different types of quilts? Like, what stands out to you as something you didn't know before, even though you are an experienced sewster?
I think, honestly, there's been so much more that's happened, you know, with this entire exhibition than just the crazy quilt, but I can't help but go back to it, and specifically, like, I feel so close to, like, finding out who even specifically she was, because somewhere on there, it's a ribbon with her initials as well, and, like, you know, there's more research that I could do, and I'm not the type to normally want to do research on my own, but, like, I want to know who she was, and so I just feel this, like, connection to somebody that, like, you know, lived a long time ago. So honestly, I think just like learning more about like who she was, and then like the crazy quilt craze, and like that it was so short-lived. Like she was there during that, and that just it really grounds it. That specifically that was my favorite.
Susie, can I ask you the same question? Was there something that you learned that, you know, stands out? I mean, because I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about it and researching.
Well, I think just the fact that art and creativity with the balance of everyday life, like I feel like that really stood out to me, and that it's not a new topic, although I've read about it and learned about it recently, we're seeing that from way, way back. So there's you were talking about poetry, there's a really silly poem that we came across and kept revisiting that's part of one of the quilting books, and it just sort of gives us a sense of that history and then familiarity and friendship and connectedness and how that gets people through challenging times. I think that's one of the things that stood out to me. Also, I had no idea how many people, even on campus, right, even people who couldn't attend today, people are really connected with the art of sewing, and I think that's pretty neat. I feel less qualified than a lot of people because the t-shirt quilt is the only quilt I've ever made. I hope to make more in my future, but I have a lot to learn.
Any other questions?
What about you?
What about you, Lisa?
Yeah.
What did you learn through this? Come on with us.
Yay, no, I wasn't prepared for my own question. I learned a lot about the Hauser family and Jane Hauser. I knew her as a library patron, right, and a reader, and like on a personal level, but I didn't know her rich history with the college or the many types of art forms that she explored, so that was fun to learn about, and her deep connection to the history of Jefferson County and historical places. And people, like one of my favorite pieces is the signature quilt, which is upstairs, where if I have the story right, she would just, I don't know, randomly ask people, like, what's your passion, and can I know your name and who you are? And so this quilt is filled with names of people she met
On their travels.
yeah, all over the country, the world, I don't know, all over. And it says what their passion is. So I really thought that, to your point about capturing your story, like, so here she is capturing the story of all these people she met, you know, in a seemingly random way, and then creating something like this tangible memory, you know, work of art. That I thought that was really fun to learn about that. And I also learned that there are more quilters at Jefferson College with more quilts than we could ever possibly display in the library. So we turned away a lot of people who offered to, like once we filled up the available spaces. So that was fun. Well, thank you all. Please visit with the Hauser family and ask about Jane. Visit with Natalie and ask about her work. Have a cookie. There's water. Wander around the library, and thank you for coming.
Thank you so much.